The evening smelled of cut grass and distant rain, the sun folding itself into a band of soft gold that made the neighborhood look like a storybook. Patricia ran toward the sidewalk with her shoes forgotten at the threshold, her voice torn raw by a single name. She reached the gate and saw them at once. Maya in a plain green dress, sitting with the slow, patient stillness that had become her world. A girl in red kneeling before her, and steady, face intent. Behind them, a man in a dark suit was crossing the lawn in a run that made his tie flap. He was not her husband. Her husband Michael had been gone for 3 years, and the house still held the echo of his footsteps. The man charging forward was Leon, Patricia's head of security, his face thunderous with alarms he could not yet name. Patricia did not slow. The years of sterile hospital rooms, of luminescent machines and specialists with polite disbelief, had hardened to a single unshakable pulse of dread. In every country she had visited, the verdict had been the same. We cannot explain this. We cannot fix what refuses to be fixed. She had traded paintings and islands and private wings in hospitals for one hope, and that hope had grown thin with every expert shrug. Tonight, she had felt something shift in the air before she saw it, a subtle rearrangement, like a held breath finally released. Tia had come from across the street, from the row of modest houses where laundry flapped and evening dinner simmered. She had seen Maya on the sidewalk many times, seen the way the other child sat outside quiet and distant, and something in Tia had tugged her forward. She did not think of wealth or danger. She only felt a tug in her chest that told her to kneel, to look closer, to touch the place where Maya kept touching, as if the irritation lived behind the skin. Tia had always been like that. When a neighbor's grandmother fell, Tia had known before the ambulance arrived. When a child at school had hidden bruises, Tia had found the way to ask without shame. People called it uncanny. Angela called it dangerous. Leon barreled across the grass, shouting for the girl in red to stop. Patricia's breath hitched. The world narrowed to a sliver of concrete and 2 small faces. Tia's fingers moved with a calm certainty that made Patricia's heart both freeze and unlock. Where surgeons had seen only tissue and plastic, the child saw something else. She tucked a curl of hair behind Maya's ear and with slow care reached into the hollow where a hearing device had often sat, where for 10 years machines and specialists had tried and failed to deliver sound. Patricia's knees found the ground, not because she meant to but because the universe folded under her. Leon's hand hovered like a shadow, ready to pull Tia away, to shield the millionaire's child from the perceived threat. Tia ignored the shouting. She did not flinch. Her small fingers closed around something so small Patricia almost missed it. A sliver of silver, no larger than a fingernail, jagged and dull but intentionally shaped. For a heartbeat the world held its breath. Then Tia twisted gently and drew the piece free. There was a sound, thin, ordinary. A dog barking 2 streets over, the metallic clink of a bicycle chain, the low rumble of a distant car. It might have been nothing to anyone who had spent their life moving through noise, but for Maya it was the first message the world had ever sent in the language she could understand. Her gaze flicked toward the bark, confusion opening into astonishment. The expression on her face cracked like porcelain as she realized the impossible. Her fingers, which had learned to sign and to point and to live with silence, lifted to her ear as if to steady the miracle. Patricia's name came out as a sound, half-formed, a breath that had never had weight before. The syllable landed in Patricia's chest like a stone. Time unstitched itself. 10 years of midnight vigils, of lectures and tests, and the temporary kindnesses of doctors who could not help, came rushing forward and collided with a single, small voice. Leon looked at the object in his hand and then at Patricia. He had been trained to read danger in a dozen different bodies, but nothing in his protocol had prepared him for this. The piece he held was not part of any approved medical device he recognized. It had been fashioned, modified, altered to perform a function nobody had imagined, to muffle, to obstruct, to make hearing into a locked room. Patricia could not think in straight lines. Her mind scribbled fragments. Michael's laugh in the kitchen, the hospital nursery light, the way she had watched other mothers hand their children crayons and heard conversation ripple and never be able to join. She thought of every specialist with their diplomas and their gentle regrets. She thought of the countless surgeries scheduled and canceled and the quiet economy that had risen around her sorrow, appointments, caregivers, consultations that in their own small way had filled people's lives. She thought of Evelyn, the housekeeper who had arranged her hospital visits and never missed an appointment, who had stayed by Maya's bedside through feverish nights, and whose hand had often been the one that tucked the blanket tighter. Maya signed with a speed that shocked even Patricia. She slapped the air twice to say listen, then pointed to her ear and mimed the sound as best she could with the fumbling vocabulary of a child newly acquainted with hearing. Tears came to Patricia's eyes without permission. She reached for Maya and felt the other child's small hands on her cheeks, felt the wetness of her mother's own grief mirrored in the child who had just learned her name. The moment was too simple and therefore unbearably huge. Leon said the word inside, the word that had been hiding in his throat since he seized the shard. Sabotage. Patricia had catalogued betrayals in her life, business deals gone sideways, charlatans who peddled false cures, but nothing had prepared her to imagine deliberate cruelty aimed at her daughter. Who would do such a thing? And why? Questions crashed over her like surf. She had the resources to find answers, to hire the best, but for the first time those resources felt like cold tools. The thing they could not buy stared up at her, Maya's face newly lit by sound, small fingers forming a clumsy version of the word Patricia, as if testing language like a new toy. The neighborhood watched in a reverent hush. A stray farmer's horn sounded, the sunset deepened, and for a few heartbeats the world held a kinder shape. Tia sat back on her heels and looked up at Patricia with an expression that belonged to someone who had done what they were supposed to do and could not yet know the consequences. Patricia's limbs trembled. She wanted to lift Tia and shake her and kiss her and thank her until the word meant nothing anymore. She wanted to clamp her hands around whoever had put that shard into her child and squeeze until the truth came out. Instead, she took the small, ordinary step of steadiness. She set her hands on Maya's shoulders and let the weight of her daughter anchor her. Leon closed his fist around the detritus of a crime and tucked it into an evidence bag with practiced care. Tia's mother, Angela, who had watched from behind her own gate, crossed the yard and stood by the women in silence. The ordinary world resumed its rotation. The streetlights blinked on. A dog barked once more, and Patricia, with the sound of her child's new hearing ringing in her ears like a fragile bell, realized that the night had split into before and after. She would not sleep tonight. There were names to find, truths to pry loose. But first she knelt, and in the space between the sunset and the small new sound of her daughter's voice, she let herself listen. The next morning, the world felt smaller and more precise, as if the previous evening had cut the fabric of things and revealed seams that had always been there. In the narrow kitchen of a two-bedroom house a block from the Logan estate, Angela packed a tin of leftover jollof into a worn plastic container with hands that worked by habit. Her movements were efficient and quiet, the way someone practiced at hiding the tremor of worry behind everyday tasks. Tia sat at the table, her hair braided into small, careful rows, and watched the sunlight run through the window like a ribbon. She hummed a tune with no words, because sound was something she had learned to love and measure, even when the world around her had not taught her how. Angela remembered the look on Patricia's face the night before, a woman made of both iron and salt, who had curled around her daughter like a second skin, and who now, after a full decade of baffled specialists, held a single bright hope in her hand. Angela had seen Patricia before, always in pictures in society pages or glimpsed from afar on the street when she collected donations for the neighborhood school. Up close, the woman was smaller than the myths, full of lines left by too many late nights and stronger than the stories had ever admitted. Tia pushed her chair back and stood, coming to Angela's side to touch the corner of the lid with one finger. She did not need permission to speak in the quiet house. Words flowed from her like water. She heard, she said, voice small and steady. The sentence was both report and miracle. Angela folded the lid and turned to her daughter with an expression that balanced awe and warning. "You must be careful," she said. Her voice had the weight of someone who had seen the way the world could sharpen its teeth at anything it could not explain. "People will come looking for reasons, Tia. Some will want to thank you. Some will want to blame you. Both will be dangerous in their own way." Tia nodded, earnest even at 7, the kind of nod that made Angela's resolve both proud and frightened. Tia had always been different. Neighbors whispered about how she would take another child's hand and find where pain lived, how she once sat by a woman's bed, and told the paramedics what medicine had been left unfinished. For Angela, those stories were not signs, they were survival. When Tia was small, Angela had dragged her to a clinic because the child refused to eat. The doctor had found an ulcer forming on the mother's stomach. Tia's gift had saved her then, and Angela had learned to fear the cost of attention. She had learned that help could look like judgment if you were on the wrong side of the city's invisible line. Meanwhile, Patricia sat in a small consultation room at a private clinic an hour from her mansion, the shard in a sterile evidence bag on the table between her hands and the silent hum of machines pressing at the edges of the conversation. The doctor across from her, a neurologist she had trusted through 3 countries and half a dozen procedures, spoke with the composed cadence of someone tasked with delivering both facts and consolation. He did not use platitudes. He did not try to make the impossible ordinary. "The fragment is not from an approved device," he said. He tapped a printout with gloved fingers, the paper crisp, the ink black and decisive. "Material analysis shows traces of alloys inconsistent with standard implants. It appears to have been custom-made. Its shape suggests it was designed to sit in the ear canal and interfere physically with sound conduction. That is not a manufacturing defect. Someone placed it intentionally." Patricia's breath seemed to pause, then shudder. The room tilted a degree and righted itself into grim focus. She pictured the incision lines, the antiseptic smell of neonatal wards, the nights she had stayed awake while technicians adjusted machines and specialists debated the next course of action. For a long time, her strategy had been motion. Fly here, consult that name, accept this test. The victories had been small and rare. The defeats had been private. The notion that any part of that vast, expensive orbit had been orchestrated by human hand made the whole strategy feel suddenly naive. Leon cleared his throat and slid a small envelope across the table. It contained a record of staff who had had intimate access to Maya in the early weeks, when exhaustion had pressed Patricia into brief, dreamless sleep, and the house had been a slow, humming machine of care. There had been names on lists before: consultants, visiting nurses, the housekeeper who had been with them since before Michael's death, but only one consistently present at every turning point. Patricia's eyes found that name and did not look away. She thought of Evelyn, 10 years of her life braided into a woman who had packed her bags for hospital trips and kept lists on sticky notes. Evelyn had been more than a housekeeper. She had been a presence, the steady hand who always knew when to warm a bottle or where to put the spare blanket. Even as Patricia sat in the antiseptic light of the clinic, a memory came to her. The first night Maya had been born, how tired and raw she had been, how someone had whispered words she barely understood and then tucked a shawl under her chin. Evelyn had stood there, shoulders steady. Patricia had nodded and slept. The thought pinched like a new bruise. Angela came to the Logan estate that afternoon because she had been invited, because someone called to say that Patricia wanted to meet the family who had given her daughter back something the world had told her could not be returned. She stood on the gravel outside the drive and watched the mansion lower its face to her like a ship taking on water. Her hands were clean but rough from work, and she smoothed them on her skirt as she walked up the path. Patricia opened the door with a softness that surprised Angela, less ceremony, more human need. The house smelled faintly of lemon oil and old books. Maya sat in a chair by the window, her hair catching the afternoon sun the way it always had, but now there was a new alertness in the set of her jaw, a brightness in her eyes that spoke louder than any test result. Tia stood slightly at the edge of the room, tiny shoulders squared against a world she had not chosen to enter. Patricia greeted Angela with a tremor in her voice that made the invitation feel more like a plea. She took Angela's hands, large and softened by years of labor, in both of hers and said simply, "Thank you." The words were small, like seeds, and they carried a weight that made both women exhale. Angela wanted to step back, to hedge, to remind Patricia that this exchange could be complicated. Instead she said, steady and practical, she did not mean to cause trouble. Tia only felt what no one else could. Her eyes flicked to Maya and then to Patricia. "But understand, things will happen now. People will want to know everything." Patricia nodded. She had already understood the first thing, that gratitude would not be simple. She had also understood, with a steadying dread, the second thing. Someone close had played a role in the years of silence that had been her child's life. The shard in the bag on the kitchen counter was a small, physical proof of that truth. It meant more than a broken night. It meant a deliberate intent. Leon's voice joined them, low and careful. "We will investigate quietly," he said. "No wide announcements. No speculation." He looked at Patricia, then at Angela, then at Tia. His expression said what the three women felt but did not say aloud. The city was a map of pockets, and some pockets hid dangerous things. Tia, who had always approached complicated moments with an innocence that unsettled adults, sat down on the carpet and began to play with a small wooden block as if she had not just altered the axis of two families' lives. Maya watched her with a tentative curiosity, lips moving as she practiced the shapes of sounds. Patricia watched them both, and for the first time in years had the strange experience of being small in a way that felt like salvation rather than failure. She reached out and let her fingers hover over Tia's head, an almost maternal touch that said welcome and thank you and I am sorry all at once. Angela read that touch and understood that lines had already begun to change. She thought of the complexity that lay ahead for her daughter, a new kind of attention, a new set of demands, the polite curiosity of strangers who would call the child a miracle until they found a way to make a story of it that no one could own. She squeezed Patricia's hand and said quietly, "Whatever comes, do not do it alone." The search began like the slow unpeeling of an onion, careful, methodical, the kind of work that left the eyes watering and the hands steady. Leon took the lead, moving through the mansion with the quiet authority of a man who had kept secrets so often they had become a second language. He catalogued cameras, checked access logs, and ordered the household staff to stay within sight lines until he called them one by one. Patricia sat at the kitchen table with a shard sealed in its evidence bag beside her, its dull metallic surface catching the afternoon light and scattering it into an ugly, small constellations that made her want to look away. The shard was a proof that someone had crossed a line she had never thought would be crossed in her home. Evelyn had been with them for years. She had been quiet in the way of women who made sure everything else ran loudly. To imagine malice in those hands was to imagine the unthinkable. Leon's questions were gentle at first, polite as a surgeon's probe. He asked about shifts and nights, and who had keys. He reviewed the visitor logs from the clinic and the hospital, tracing the arcs of those who had accompanied Patricia and Maya to appointments. A pattern emerged. Evelyn's name appeared at every pivot. Where consultants changed, Evelyn remained. She shipped bags for long trips, sat through dozens of consultations, and was present the night a surgeon adjusted a device and left, the machine's light blinking into a small, ordinary glow. Patricia had never doubted Evelyn's motives. She had found in her the kind of loyalty that felt rarer than trust. The ledger of appointments became a ledger of intimacy. When Leon asked Evelyn to come into the study, her entrance was practiced, hands folded, head dipped, a neutrality learned over years of service. She smelled faintly of lavender and the steady antiseptic of hospital linen. She had always seemed most at home in the orbit of tending. Her eyes flicked to the bag on the table, and then to Patricia's face, and for a moment Evelyn's composure held like glass. Patricia watched her carefully, and found that something in the woman she had trusted had shifted the way light shifts through old glass, a small, almost invisible clouding. Evelyn sat and folded her hands the way someone settles into expected conversation. Leon spoke first, his voice steady, the man who had learned to deliver hard news with a tone that tried to hold the edges of people together. He explained the shard and where it had been found. He explained the analysis. He watched as Evelyn's expression moved through a sequence of emotions that left Patricia feeling like a bystander's witness to an intimate private play. Evelyn said nothing at first. The silence filled the room like a held breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and careful. She told of the hospital nights, of how Patricia had slept and she had stayed awake, watching machines and soothing nurses and answering a small, private list of emergencies that rarely had anything to do with money. She described the nights when she stayed because Patricia's hands trembled and the world had fallen somewhere into shards of grief after Michael's death. She spoke of the trips and the clinic visits and how she had learned to bring tea in the early hours when the specialists left exhausted. Patricia listened and felt each memory as if through a film reel that no longer held a soundtrack. Evelyn's story should have been proof enough of her devotion. Instead, the shard on the table peeled open the possibility that devotion had been braided with something else. Fear. The fear of abandonment. The fear of being cast aside when the need was gone. The idea lodged in Patricia like a splinter. Leon asked the question everyone wanted to ask but had not yet dared. Had Evelyn ever been alone with Maya in a way that allowed for private hands-on care? Evelyn's answer was precise. She had been present when the infant slept, when the baby cried in the middle of the night, when the staff counted and recounted the hours. She had been there in the nursery, in the short windows when the house was a quiet, mechanical organism. She had carried bottles and warmed blankets, and had visited the clinic late at night to fetch forgotten prescriptions. Her attendance had been thorough, her presence near constant. Patricia felt the room narrowing, the edges sharp. She had always mistaken proximity for intention. She had retired into a belief that close meant benign. Now the ledger of proximity read like a map of opportunity. Patricia had questions that were not for the public. She wanted to understand motive. Leon watched Evelyn's face for the slightest change when Patricia asked about money, about resentment, about anything that might explain why someone would damage a child's capacity to experience sound. Evelyn's fingers twisted a handkerchief until the fabric strained. Did you do this?" Patricia asked, the words tasting like iron. Her voice was not placed to accuse, so much as to find a chink in the story. Evelyn's mouth opened and closed. Tears leaked out with a slowness that made Patricia's chest ache. Evelyn's confession came like a slow leak. She said she had been afraid. She said that after Michael's death the household had shifted, that doctors came and went, that some nurses had been kind and others had been distant. She spoke of nights when she pressed her own face into the crook of her elbow and felt the tremors of bills and rent and the knowledge that she had been, for years, dependent on a family who might not need her forever. Her hands found Patricia's in a motion that was almost an apology. She described small acts at first. Untied shoelaces, warmed clothes, the kind of tiny sabotage that kept a mother close and needy. Then, finally, with a voice that frayed at the edges, she told Patricia that she had taken something from the hospital she thought would not be discovered, something she thought would only slow the progress of the implants, not harm them. She had convinced herself that with a small obstruction, she could keep the child needing care and therefore keep a place in the home. The confession fell out like a broken tooth. Evelyn wept and said she did not understand how such a thing could have been sanctioned by her love. She begged for mercy in the only language she had known, service. Patricia had known betrayal before, in business and in public life, but this betrayal was intimate in a way that made her bones ache. She tried to balance rage and the residual warmth of the hands that had folded sheets and packed bags and sang lullabies. Evelyn's actions had been calculated and cowardly, and the reasons were the fragile, ugly things people allowed themselves when terrified. For a long time Patricia could only hold the contradiction. Evelyn had been tenderness made flesh and a thief of sound. The room hummed with impossibility. Maya sat nearby, looking between the adults with a curiosity that was both childlike and newly aware. Tia, who had not been asked to decode adult treachery, sat with her knees drawn up and watched as if a storm might break into the room at any second. Patricia rose and walked out of the study without speaking, and did not notice Angela slipping after her into the hallway. She went to the nursery, the place that had once been a hospital's soft light and a mother's overwhelmed patience. The nursery smelled faintly of lavender and powder, of the clean scent Evelyn always favored. Now it felt like a scene from a play with all the actors frozen. Her hands landed on the crib rail and trembled there. She reflected on the years of carefulness, on the rituals that had become scaffolding for a life of sorrow. She thought of Michael, his laugh, the way he had once taken Maya in his arms to test an old radio, the small domesticity that had never threatened their wealth. She thought of the house, the staff, the quiet economies that ran beneath her household's opulence. And she thought, with a clarity that felt like a blade, of how fear could push a person into monstrous decisions. The day the household learned to breathe again did not arrive like a miracle. It arrived in small, precise steps, the cadence of therapy sessions, the click of appointments on a calendar, the careful logistics of truth and consequence. Morning light moved across the living room, where Maya practiced sound with a patience that had always lived inside her quiet body. She repeated syllables like a person learning the shape of a new country, her lips forming the odd new weights of letters. Patricia sat close, her hand a steady presence on Maya's knee, listening to each attempt with the reverence of someone hearing an instrument tuned for the first time. The legal counsel Leon had summoned moved with the efficiency he had always brought to crises, discreet, thorough, unemotional in public and exacting in private. There would be a report filed, formal statements taken. There would be interviews, and perhaps, if the press learned of the breach, a story that would try to make villains and saints from the scraps of a private life. Patricia agreed to the procedure with a calm that surprised even her. She understood the necessity of consequence. She also understood the dangerous hunger of a headline. She wanted justice without spectacle. She wanted truth without theater. And she wanted, most of all, to protect Maya's slow, fragile new world. Evelyn's days followed a different gravity. There were moments when she simply could not meet Patricia's eyes, and moments when she looked up with a sudden clarity like someone waking from a fevered dream. The family's lawyer explained the options with the blunt clarity of someone who had seen human stories collapse and rebuild. Evelyn would be charged. The law would take its course. Patricia had insisted, gently but firmly, that nothing would be hidden. If there was to be punishment, it would be measured. If there was to be apology, it would not be muffled. Evelyn accepted this with a humility that had been years in the making. She gave statements that broke at the edges and then strengthened with the small, honest fabric of regret. She described fear not as an excuse, but as the raw material of a terrible choice. She did not try to soften what she had done with language. She admitted the theft, the concealment, the deliberate placement of the fragment. She asked for mercy. She asked for a chance to make small amends, the only currency she felt she could afford. Service, labor, whatever would keep her present in a life she had been too scared to imagine beyond the walls of the house. Patricia listened, and in listening found that her own rage had softened into something stranger. It was not forgiveness in a single breath. It was a decision about the world she wanted to teach her child, about how adults move through the wreckage of mistakes. She thought of the years Maya would watch how she responded, and she thought of a small luminous moment when Maya had first turned toward the sound of a distant dog. She thought of Tia, sitting on the carpet, hands busy with a wooden block as if the whole shift had been nothing more than play. She thought of Angela's voice the night before, practical and grave, do not do it alone. So Patricia made a choice that startled even those who knew her best. She insisted that Evelyn be held to account, that law and consequence proceed without interference. But she would not let the household answer the wound with a hunger for vengeance. Evelyn would not be cast out entirely. Patricia arranged for restitution in a way that acknowledged both responsibility and human frailty. Evelyn would be allowed to take a position of service that did not involve direct care of Maya. She would return to the community to help with the very initiatives Patricia funded, after-school programs, medical clinics, the neighborhood food drives. The arrangement was pragmatic. It was also a lesson. When the day of the hearing arrived, the small courtroom was neither crowded nor silent. Evelyn stood with her shoulders slightly bowed and a clarity in her voice that had been sharpened by sleep and legal counsel. Patricia attended with Maya at her side, small fingers curled into the hem of her dress. Tia sat beside Angela, hands folded, their presence a quiet chorus of witness. The judge read the facts with a voice that felt like a scale balancing weighty moments. There was a sentence for the crime, calibrated to both punishment and the possibility of restitution. Evelyn accepted it. She did not ask for the press to turn her into a cautionary tale. She asked only to be allowed to live a life that might, in some slow way, repair the harm she had committed. Outside the courthouse, the air tasted of rain. The press had not yet descended, and the neighborhood watched as if holding its breath. Patricia walked to Evelyn then, not as a monarch delivering a decree, but as a woman who had learned a more complicated grammar of justice. Evelyn's hands found Patricia's, and in that moment, everything that had been raw shifted into something that could be explained without spectacle. Patricia said, quietly, that they would begin again with boundaries. Evelyn nodded like someone waking and learning where the lines were. Maya's rehabilitation unfolded with the clinical patience of therapy and the private joys of discovery. Sound drills, exercises in articulation, the clumsy, beautiful attempts to couple a sign with a spoken word. It was the work of patient cultivation. The therapists marveled at Maya's responsiveness. Her brain, they said, was hungry to learn the textures of sound. Patricia watched each small achievement like a lantern lighting, and she made sure the milestones were celebrated in ways that honor the children around her who had helped make them possible. Tia became part of those celebrations. Patricia found reasons to invite Angela and Tia for lessons, to pay for additional sessions, to weave them into an extended fabric of support. She wanted gratitude that was not transactional. She wanted the children to see one another as part of a common story rather than as curiosities. Angela, who had once been fearful of the attention her daughter might draw, found herself confronted with a new reality. Opportunities appeared. Grants for Tia's school, calls from community groups eager to understand the child who had felt what others could not. Angela navigated these with a guardianship that was practical and guarded. She accepted help when it would secure Tia's future and rebuffed it when it smelled like spectacle. Patricia respected her limits. They built a cautious friendship, formed from the fragile trust of two mothers whose lives had been shuffled into a new deck of obligations. Tia and Maya's friendship deepened in ways that surprised even the adults. They played in the garden with the awkward concentration of children turning strangers into companions. Tia taught Maya the small, secret ways of the neighborhood, where the best mangoes fell, how to catch a cricket without killing it, how to listen to the difference between a storm and ordinary rain. Maya taught Tia the patience of sound. She would press a wooden block to her ear and nudge Tia's hand to make a small noise. They laughed at the odd rhythms of newly learned words. The house, once a place of hallowed rituals, became a room where small sounds stitched the walls back into place. One evening, months after the shard had been removed, Patricia sat on the sofa with Maya nestled in her lap, listening to the radio play a song they both knew. Maya had learned to sing along in a way that was not perfect but whole. Her voice was thin and bright like new glass. Evelyn stood at the doorway watching, her posture a mixture of distance and longing. Patricia noticed and called to her, asking her to come in. Evelyn crossed the room slowly, and for a moment the house contained all the histories it had held in its rooms, the meals, the midnight vigils, the whispered apologies. Evelyn's face was open and honest in a way that had taken months to arrive. She knelt before Maya and, with hands that trembled, placed a small folded paper into Patricia's hand. It was Evelyn's plan for community service, volunteer lists, and a modest offer of monthly restitution. She did not expect forgiveness, only the chance to live in a world where her hands could be useful without causing harm. Maya looked up and, without ceremony, reached forward to take Evelyn's hand. She signed the one word she had been practicing to mean sorry, not as surrender but as a recognition of human complication. Then, with a courage that seemed larger than her small body, she pushed her voice out and said, clearly, the name she had said the first day, Patricia. The sound settled in the room like a ribbon. Evelyn's shoulders bowed and the tears that came were not all shame. Some were relief. Some were the admission that the world could be both punishable and merciful. Patricia held the moment like a fragile thing and then let it settle into place. The work ahead would not be easy, and the household's equilibrium had been altered forever. There would be therapy schedules, guardianship meetings, and the quiet business of teaching a child how to live with new senses. There would also be the slow repair of trust. But in that house at that hour, an idea took root, that listening was not the same as understanding, and that choosing to listen made room for both accountability and compassion. Later that night, when the family had quieted and the bedroom lights had been dimmed, Patricia sat by the window and watched the moon pull its silver arc across the sky. Maya slept beside her, and somewhere beyond the gates, Tia and Angela went home under a rain-washed sky. Patricia thought of Michael, of Evelyn, of Tia and Angela, and of the shard that had forced truth into daylight. She thought about the kind of person she wanted Maya to become, the sort of human who, when faced with cruelty, could still choose to listen. The choice would not erase the harm. It would, however, teach a child what it meant to be whole in a world that was often fractured. In the quiet that followed, Patricia whispered a promise to herself and to her daughter, that they would build their lives around truth, consequence, and an expansive kind of mercy that did not excuse harm but also did not let hatred raise the next generation. Maya stirred and reached for her mother's hand. Patricia squeezed back, a small, fierce constancy, and for the first time since the shard had been found, she allowed herself to believe that the sound that had returned to her home could teach them all how to listen.